Tov. We're almost finished here on Daf Ayin Vav Amid Beis, about to turn to Daf Ayin Zayin. Now, the last thing we were discussing was the source for the halacha in the Mishnah of Chamisha Dvarim of Korbanos Tzibbur. 5 categories that are mentioned are enumerated here in the Mishnah on Daf Ayin Vav Amid Beis of Korbanos Tzibbur that have 2 unique halachas that apply to a Korban Tzibbur. Number 1, it's Dochet Shabbos, and number 2, it overrides Tumah. Now, when we say it overrides Tumah, it means either Rov of Yisrael are Tmeim, Rov Kahal are Tmeim, or it would also include a case where the Kohanim are Tmeim, and thirdly, it would include a case where both the Kol are Tahorim and the Kohanim are Tahorim, but the Kli Shares are Tmeim. In all these cases, we will bring the Korban Tzibbur despite the Tumah, and the Gemara is going to try to derive this from various possible sources. Now, the Gemara, if you recall, that we saw at the end of Yom Chamishi, was bothered by the absence of a 6th category, and these are the Seirim of the Shalosh Regalim. And they are also mentioned in the parsha of the Korbanos HaMoadim, and yet apparently they're omitted somehow from our Mishnah. And why? There's no reason why the Korbanos Tzibbur, the Seirim of the Shalosh Regalim, should not override the Shabbos and override Tumah, like all the other Korbanos of the Moadim. Because you have in the Mishnah a whole list. You have the Korban HaOmer and the Shtei Alechem and so forth. So the Gemara answers that Enoch Hinami, the Mishnah was not compelled to mention the Seirim of the Regalim because the Mishnah found it sufficient to say Seirei Shalmei Tzibur, Zivchei Shalmei Tzibur. Zivchei Shalmei Tzibur is an overarching category that includes even the Seirim of the Moadim. So Gemara says, wait a minute, if you're telling me that Shalmei Tzibur includes all Shalmei Tzibur, including the Shalosh Regalim, the Seirim of Shalosh Regalim, what about the Seirim of Rosh Chodesh? If you take a look on the list, the Mishnah has 5 categories, the last of which is Seirei Rashi Chadashim. Well, the Seirim of Rashi Chadashim are also Zivchei Tzibur, and therefore they should be included in Zivchei Shalmei Tzibur. And that's where we're up to here. Ihachi. This is Mamish at the end of Ayin Vav Amid Beis. The last line, Ihachi, Seirei Rashi Chadashim Nami Lo Lisni. There was no logical justification for adding Seirei Rashi Chadashim, no less than Seirei Regalim. They should be included in the general category of Zivchei Shalmei Tzibur, all of which override the Shabbos and the Tumah. Da'atani Zivchei Shalmei Tzibur Amri. So now we're going to start Daf Ayin Zayin Amud Aleph. This is going to be an analysis of the Havamina. If the Mishnah had just simply said in a generic sense, Zivchei Shalmei Tzibur, we would have thought that Seirei Rashi Chadashim come under a lesser category than other Shalmei Tzibur, and therefore they would not override the Shabbos or override the Tumah. Seirei Rashi Chadashim Itzrich Salke Dait Chamina, I would have thought, Olo Ksivbei Moed. When we talk about the parsha of the Korbanos of the Moadim, then we always have the word Moed to include all those Korbanos. But Rosh Chodesh is not called a Moed. And if it's not called a Moed, then it would not override neither the Shabbos nor the Tumah. And that's already a precursor of what's coming around the bend that we're going to derive from the word b'moado, that there's a time urgency here because the nature of the day, it's called the day of Moed, that overrides the Shabbos, overrides Tumah. Now Tosfos on the top of this Amud Dibra Maskal Salka Daitoch is bothered because if you look at the end of Parshas Pinchas, at the end of Sefer Dvar Bamidbar, in the parsha of the Moadim, with regard to the Korbanos, because we have two parshios of Korbanos. We have the Korbanos in Parshas Pinchas, and then we have the Korbanos in Parshas Emor. But in Parshas Pinchas, which is the parsha of the Moadim, Rosh Chodesh appears on the list, at the end of which the Torah says in a generic sense, Eile Tasu Hashem b'moadechem. So the word b'moadechem is going on all the above, including Rosh Chodeshim. But Tosfos says that we would have a havamina that even though it says b'moadechem, that includes only the regalim that are mentioned in the parsha, but not Rosh Chodesh. The word b'moadechem in the havamina before our Mishnah does not relate to Rosh Chodesh because Rosh Chodesh is not called a moed. And what it means is that what's unique about the regalim as opposed to Rosh Chodesh is that this is Zman Kavua. Rosh Chodesh doesn't really have a Zman Kavua insofar as it might be a Mu'ubar, which, as we call it, a Chodesh Mole of 30 days. It might be a Chodesh Chaser of 29 days. So Rosh Chodesh is never actually predetermined. It's always up in the air. But then we count from Rosh Chodesh another 15 days, and we have Sukkot, we have Pesach, Shavuos on the 6th day, so forth and so on. So those are Moadim. Moadim means Zman Kavua. So the Gemara now needs to understand the Mishnah. Why the Mishnah had to mention Seirei Rosh Chodeshim? The answer is because in the Havamina we thought that Rosh Chodesh is not called a Moed. The Gemara now is going to answer the following question. Well, why is Rosh Chodesh called a Moed? I mean, after all, if you're telling me that there's not as man kavua for Rosh Chodesh, then how do I know that when the pasuk says b'moadechem at the end of the parsha in Pinchas, it includes even Rosh Chodeshim? Mashmon degam Rosh Chodesh Ikrei Moed. Now it's very interesting. The Gemara is going to actually quote a pasuk in Tanakh, not in the Chumash, to prove that Rosh Chodesh is called a Moed. And of all places, the Gemara Abai stretches his arm out all the way to Megillas Eicha. And there he finds an allusion in the pasuk that uses the word Moed to Rosh Chodesh. Again, Rosh Chodesh is not mentioned in the pasuk in Iyov. I'm sorry, in Eicha. But Abai interprets the word Moed in the pasuk in Eicha as referring to Rosh Chodesh. So in just a minute, after we see Abai's interpretation of the word Moed in Eicha, we're going to come back to the following question. How does that teach me anything about the parsha in Pinchas when we have a principle of Divrei Torah mi Divrei Kabbalah lo yalfina? Well, I'll get to that in a minute. Kid Abai, we're proving now that the word Moed in Tanakh means Rosh Chodesh. The Amar Abaye, this is Gemara at the end of Masechet Tainis with regard to the day of Tisha B'Av and the commemoration of the Churban Abayis. Tammuz, the High Shata. Now we're going back to the Dar of the Meraglim. And Moshe sends the Meraglim, and they return. And after they give their very negative report, Klal Yisrael starts crying. They cry through the night. And Chazal say that that was a Bechia L'Chinam, and because the Bechia L'Chinam, Hashem was koveh that day as a Bechia L'Doros. And that was the day of Tisha B'Av of Churban Abayis. So it all begins with the story of the Meraglim. Now, in the light of that historical sequence of events, we must come to the conclusion that the Meraglim returned with their bad report on the 8th of Tammuz. I'm sorry, on the 8th of Av. And what that means is that after they gave their report, the night following the 8th of Av was the night of Bechil Adoros. Now, in order for the 8th of Av to be the day on which the Meraglim returned, we have to go back to the Pasuk, and we have to assume the Pasuk is going to be Kirolai Moed, that Tammuz Dai Shaita Miluye Malyu, that Tammuz would have to be a mole and have 30 days, so that the day that the Meraglim returned was actually the 8th of Av. And Abai says if you go through the calculations, you'll find that that year Tammuz was a mole. And therefore, the Chsiv, the Pasuk says, beginning of Eicha, you know that Eicha, I don't have to tell you, is Yirmiya's kinos on the Churban Abayis. It says, Kara alai moed lishbar bachurai. The lishbar bachurai is a foretelling of the destruction at the time of the Churban. And this Pasuk is referring to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Kara alai moed. The word Kara means he summoned it. Zimein alai moed. And that moed is Rosh Chodesh Tammuz. Hashem set it up that Rosh Chodesh Tammuz would be a mole, and that's called Kirolai Moed, so that in the divine plan, the Bechil Adoros, because the Meraglim would come back on the 8th of Av, would be on the 9th of Av. In any event, it comes out that according to the drasha of Abaye, the Kra Alai Moed, that Moed is a reference to Rosh Chodesh. Now, I'll be honest with you, I never understood it that way. The way I was brought up, this pasuk was referring to Tisha B'Av itself. And that's why if you take a look in the Ramah Paskins that we don't say Tachnun on Tisha B'Av, which is a very paradoxical kind of halacha. You know, if you'd ask me which day of the calendar year deserves Tachnun more than any other day, it would be Tisha B'Av. But Tisha B'Av is called a Moed. And you have the whole philosophy that the Mashiach is born on Tisha B'Av, etc., etc. That this, you know, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu sows the seeds of the ultimate redemption, the rebuilding of the Mikdash on Tisha B'Av itself. And that's why we have Nechama on Tisha B'Av, etc., etc. But if you read this Gemara, Abai is saying something else, that Kra Alai Moed is not referring to Tisha B'Av, but rather it's referring to Rosh Chodesh Av. And Rosh Chodesh Av is called a Moed. Otherwise, the Gemara is not justified in deriving from Abaye that the Torah considers Rosh Chodesh as a Moed. And it's only because of this drasha that we are able to justify the conclusion that the Seirim of Rosh Chodesh, like the Seirim of any Moed, override not only the Shabbos, but also Tumah. Now, all of the Mepharshim ask the following question. We have a principle of Divrei Torah mi Divrei Kabbalah lo yalfinu. This is Divrei Kabbalah. It doesn't say anywhere in Tanakh. I shouldn't say that. I should say it doesn't say anywhere in the Torah that Rosh Chodesh is called a Moed. As we said before, it's not a day that's kavua because it fluctuates from month to month. It could either be 30 days and 29 days. And we are only deriving the conclusion that when the Torah at the end of Parshas Pinchas, the Parsha of the Korbanos Moadim, it says Bim Moadechem, it's referring not only to the Regalim, but also Rosh Chodesh that's mentioned in the Parsha. And we derive that from a pasuk in Iyov, in Eicha. And the answer to this question really lies at the beginning of Bava Kama. The Gemara asks, what does it mean when it says in Parshas Mishpatim, Ki Yigach Ish Shar Shareyehu? What is he negicha? And the Gemara identifies Negicha as Negifa and quotes a pasuk in Tanakh to prove that. So the Gemara asks, well, what are you telling me? That you can't derive a pshat and a pasuk in the Torah from a pasuk in Divrei Kabbalah. And the Gemara answers, Gili Milsa Shiny, that if we're not deriving halacha from Divrei Kabbalah, because that has a Drabanan status or somewhere in between, but we're using a pasuk in Divrei Kabbalah to shed a light on a pasuk in the Torah, because we don't know how to teach, how to interpret and translate a pasuk in the Torah, then we stretch out our arm to anywhere in Tanakh, and that's going to reveal what the pasuk means in the Torah. And this would fit like a glove here in our sugya, because we don't know what the Torah had in mind when it said b'moadechem. What days in the calendar year can we enumerate and list as b'moadechem? Would Rosh Chodesh that's mentioned in the parsha, and the Seirim Rosh Chodesh do appear in the parsha in Bamidbar Chavtes, are the Seirim Rosh Chodesh included in the word Moadechem? And we're going to stretch our arm out to Kra Alai Moed, the way Abaye interprets it, that Rosh Chodesh is called a Moed. And that's not called the Alfinon. We're not deriving any halachic conclusions. Once we know that the pasuk b'moadechem at the end of Parshas Pinchas includes even Seirei Rosh Chodesh that are mentioned in the parsha, is Memela Seirim Rosh Chodesh as a classic Korbanos Tzibbur on Dolche, both Shabbos and Tumah. So the Gemara asks, L'meimra de Kula Mimoed Asu Minali Mili. How do you know that a Korbanos Tzibbur overrides Tumah in those three cases that we described from the fact that it says Moed? Give me some sort of a source and a proof for the fact that calling something a Moed and a korban that is related to a Moed means that it overrides the Tumah. Minali Mili. And the Gemara answers, Tana Rabbana, we learned it in a Bryce. Now we're going back from Pinchas backwards to Parshas Emor. And there we have the Parsha of the Korbanos HaMoadim. Not necessarily Musafim, they are left for Parshas Pinchas, but the Korbanos of the Moadim. And the Parsha opens, Vayidaber Moshe Moadi Hashem al Bnei Yisrael. And the Gemara is perplexed here by this pasuk, because all the Moadim are written in the Parsha. So why did the Torah have to go out of its way to tell us that Moshe transmitted the Moadim to Bnei Yisrael? I mean, the Torah is the transmission of Moshe Rabbeinu. All the Moadim are mentioned there in Parshas Emor. What's this koteret? Vaydaber Moshe Moadi Hashem. Ma Talmud Lomer. What's it coming to teach us? And the answer is, it's coming to teach us the halacha that these korbanos of the Moadim override the Shabbos and Tumah. Lefi shelo lamadnu, we only know in the Torah of two korbanos where the Torah went out of its way to say b'moado. And the word b'moado in these two parshios, in these two korbanos, we're not talking about Parshas Emor now. B'moado means with the urgency of the moment. This is the date and this is the time that you bring this Korbanos Tzibbur. And that means it overrides the Shabbos, overrides Tumah, because of the urgency of b'moado. Now, which of these two, where in the constellation of Korbanos do we have two Korbanos that certainly are the paradigmic cases of overriding the Shabbos and Tumah? Those are going to be the Korban Tamid and the Korban Pesach. Why? Elo l'tamidu Pesach shenemar b'hu b'moado. Now here, just to translate this line in the Gemara, lends itself to two different translations. And if you take a look at Tosfos back on Daf Samach Vav, Tosfos says that the language of the Brisa, if you translate this Brisa literally, Elo l'tomid v'pesach shenemar b'hu b'moado, it sounds like the word moado is going to teach us that we override the Shabbos and the Tumah. However, he says that he has a proof from a different brisa that that's not what's going on over here, but rather one moado is respective of one din and the other of another din. In other words, we're not learning from one word b'moado, which appears both in the parsha of Tamid and in the parsha of Korban Pesach, that overrides both Tumah and Shabbos. But rather, says Tosfos, and again, it's not the mashmos of our brisa, each word b'moado, respective of either Tamid or of Pesach, teaches me a different din. We need Tamid to teach me the din of overriding the Shabbos, and then we need the Moado of Korban Pesach to teach me the din of overriding Tumah. And then we have a Gzeira Shava that equates Tamid and Korban Pesach. So again, we're deriving two din of Dechiyah. One is the din of Dechiyah of Shabbos, and the other, the Dechiyah of Tumah. The simple reading of our brisa indicates that wherever you see the word moado, you derive two conclusions, both overriding the Shabbos and overriding Tumah. And since b'moado appears both in the parsha of Tamid and in the parsha of Pesach, hence in these two korbanos we have a dechiyah of both both Tumah and Shabbos. However, Tosfos says, based on a different brisa, not our brisa, this is back on Daf Samach Vav, that no. We need a combination of Tamid and Pesach, each one teaching me a different din. And he writes that one pasuk in the Tamid teaches me that the Tamid b'moado means every day of the week, including Shabbos, and it overrides the Shabbos. Then we have a pasuk b'moado in Korban Pesach, and that's going to teach me to override Tumah. And once I have both, I have Tamid vis-a-vis Shabbos and Pesach vis-a-vis Tumah. Now there's a Gzeira Shava b'moado, and that's going to teach me that whatever it says in this applies to this vice versa. So since Tamid overrides the Shabbos, therefore by virtue of this Gzeira Shava, Pesach overrides the Shabbos. And since Korban Pesach overrides Tumah in those three cases that we mentioned earlier, because of the word b'moado, so too Korban Tamid will override Tumah. So the Gemara says the following. With regard to Tamid and Pesach, Nemar Behu b'moado, the Torah says b'moado in both parshios. In Korban Tamid, in Parshas Pinchas, it says Savas b'nei Yisrael v'amarta alehem es karbani lachmi. Remember that Korban Tamid is a very unique korban. It's the only korban about it says lachmi. It's a very special korban. And reach li shai, reach nichochi tishmeru, lakriv li b'moado. In Korban Pesach, at the very beginning of Midbar and Parshas Ba'alot, it says Vayasu b'nei Yisrael sa Pesach b'moado. Therefore, these two korbanos is b'moado afil b'Shabbos, b'moado afil b'Tumah. They override Shabbos and Tumah. But with regard to Shar Korbanos Tzibbur, minayin, and the answer is that the word b'moado in a different form, albeit, appears in the parsha of the Korbanos Hamad. Now we're skipping and hopping over to Sefer Bamidbar Parshas Pinchas. So again, whereas the Tamid appears in Parshas Pinchas, but the Korban Pesach does not appear in Parshas Pinchas, but nevertheless in Parshas Pinchas, after enumerating all the special Korbanos of the Moadim, Nemar, it says in the pasuk, Eile tasu Hashem b'mo'adechem. And b'mo'adechem is going to include, number one, all the korbanos of the Moadim, and number two, the korbanos of Rosh Chodashim, based on the drasha of Abaye. But now we go back to our Mishnah, and we find in our Mishnah, included in the list of overriding the Tumah, we have the Omer and the Shtei Alechem. Now, when they brought the Omer was accompanied by a Keves Li'ola, and we'll see the pasuk. And the Shtei Alechem on Chag HaShavuos were accompanied also by a special korban. We'll go through the psukim. In Parshas Emor, it says, "Vasisem biyom hanifchem es haomer keves tomim ben shnaso li'ola Hashem," so that the korban Omer, which was obviously a korban mincha, but it was accompanied by a korban ola, which was an ola of a keves tomim. And in the parsha of the Shtei Alechem of Chag HaShavuos, and this is also in Parshas Emor, it says, "V'kravtem al halechem shivas kvasim tmimim b'nei shana," etc., etc. So there's a whole list of korbanos that must accompany the Shtei Alechem on Chag HaShavuos. Both of these psukim that generate or form a source for the respective chiyuvim of the korbanos that accompany the Omer or the Shtei Alechem, these psukim appear in Parshas Emor. They're not included in Parshas Pinchas. So when you derive the halacha of being doche tumah from b'mo'adechem in Parshas Pinchas, how does that serve as a source to derive that the korban Omer or the korban Shtei Alechem, where the Torah records and mandates those two korbanos in Parshas Emor, how do you know that they override the Tumah? The Mishnah says amongst the 5 Korbanos Tzibbur that override Tumah, we have the Omer and the Shtei Alechem. Is minayin l'rabos Omer hakarav imo. The hakarav imo means the keves li'ola that's brought together with the Omer. Ushtei Alechem v'chol hakarav imo. I add the word kol here because with regard to the Shtei Alechem, we have a whole slew of korbanos that accompany the Shtei Alechem on Chag HaShavuos. And these are all delineated by the Torah Parshas Emor. It's not included in the B'mo'adechem at the end and the closure of Parshas Pinchas. Talmud Lomar. Now we go to Parshas Emor, and the opening line in Parshas Emor to all of the Moadim and all the Korbanos of the Moadim, including the Omer and the Shtei Alechem, is Vaydaber Moshes Moadei Hashem al Bnei Yisrael. And why was this pasuk necessary? But the answer is because the word Moadim, Moadei Hashem. And this teaches us Hakosiv Kavo Moed Echad L'Kulam, even the Korbanos that only appear in the Parsha of Emor and are not reflected in the Parsha of Pinchas, they are also, for example, the korbanos that accompany the Omer and the Shtei Alechem called Moadim. So Parshas Emor went out of its way to use this opening line of Moadei Hashem in order to reflect and expand the scope of B'mo'adechem at the end of Parshas Pinchas, so that now we can include the korbanos of the Omer and the Shtei Alechem in the halacha of being doche tumah. Okay, now we have a little bit of an exciting Gemara. The Gemara wants to know, why does the Torah have to say moed with regard to all Korbanos Tzibbur? Why not just lump together all Korbanos Tzibbur as one entity? And teach me that if you have one Korban Tzibbur, like for example the Korban Tamid, it overrides Tumah, overrides the Shabbos, and then I'll apply a binyan ah. and I'll equate all Korbanos Tzibbur with the carbon tamid. And why do we need all these drushes of b'moadechem or moadei Hashem in order to establish these dinim and the power of the Korban Tzibbur to override Tumah or Shabbos? Kol hani lamali. Why do I need them all? You know that Tamid and Pesach are both called Moado, and in both cases you override Tumah and Shabbos. So why not just give me those two cases, and I'll be makish all the other Korbanos Tzibbur to those two. These two of Tamid and Pesach become paradigmic of a Korban Tzibbur. Korban Tzibbur overrides the Shabbos. A Korban Tzibbur overrides Tumah.
Can I ask a question, please?
Yeah, please.
Abaye's assumption, or the pasuk about Koralai Moed that refers to Rosh Chodesh,
right.
If a pasuk in the Torah that says exactly the opposite. B'yom simchaschem u'mubedorachem u'roshei chodshechem. You have
so
Moadim and Rosh Chodesh are totally different.
Right. So the question is where you put the comma, meaning when it says b'moadechem u'v'roshei chodshechem, is the comma telling me that what's included in moadechem is also roshei chodshechem? And this is really a machlokas rishonim about the mitzvah of Hallel, where there's Hallel on Rosh Chodesh, because the pasuk speaks about blowing the chatzotros, from which we derive the mitzvah of Hallel. And if you learn moadechem kama roshei chodshechem, which are included in moadechem, then Hallel is doraisa on Rosh Chodesh. This is the Shittas Ramban, that Rosh Chodesh is also called Moadechem. I mean, you really have to learn a sugya in Erechin about Hallel, but whatever the sugya is there, and Rav Soloveitchik used to always say that if you read the Ramban carefully, the Ramban is talking about Hallel in the Beis HaMikdash on Rosh Chodesh, meaning Rosh Chodesh has one status inside the Mikdash and a whole different status outside the Mikdash. So our minhag to recite Hallel on Rosh Chodesh outside of the Beis HaMikdash is not doraisa, it's only a minhag, because even if you accept the Ramban, the minhag was only expanding and extending the original chi of Hallel on Rosh Chodesh from the Beis HaMikdash to outside the Beis HaMikdash. Okay. But in any event, in the light of Abayi's drush, I would say that now we should take the word B'roshei Chodshechem and read it with a comma before it as an example of Moadechem, and that now Rosh Chodesh is called the Moed.
Okay.
In any event, the Gemara says Tzrich. The Ikas of Rahman Tamid. Okay, Tamid is called Moed, and therefore it overrides the Tumah or the Shabbos. Is Hava. I mean, I would have said Tamid Shekain Tadir. We have to put carbon Tamid on a very special level. It has two dimensions that make it unique. One is common to other korbanos of that sort, but one is absolutely unique. One is tadir. We bring the carbon tamid every day, twice a day, shacharis and ben arbayim, without any exception. There's no day that's left out. And therefore the Torah says that carbon tamid overrides the Shabbos. Also kolil. It's considered completely burnt on the Mizbeach, like any carbon ola. And now we need another pasuk to teach me that Pesach overrides Shabbos and Tumah, because Pesach is lacking, is bereft of these two special qualities. Aval Pesach, which is neither a tadir carbon, it's once a year, and number two, it is not kolil. In other words, there are parts of the murim, the chalavim that are burnt on the mizbeach, but the balance of the carbon is eaten by the bailim, so it doesn't have that extra element of lashem, and maybe therefore it doesn't have the power to override Shabbos and Tumah like Tamid is. Is therefore lo yidche lo satum v'lo Shabbos kamashmon. But wait a minute, why not flip it around with a kal v'chomer? Why not just tell me b'moado in Pesach, which is lacking those two unique elements of Tamid, and I'll derive Tamid with a Kal V'chomer. Tamid is a greater level than Pesach. Ikos Rachmana Pesach, I would have said Pesach shehu anush kares. All right, it's once a year, and we're going to eat. I mean, the Zbeach will eat, and we'll give a share to the Bailim to eat. But it's very chamor. It's a chiv kares. You know, we don't find that if you don't bring the carbon tamid, it's a chiv kares. Only in Pesach there's a chiv kares. How tamid the anush kares. Ema low, I would have had me to say it doesn't override neither the Shabbos nor Tumah. Kamash Malan. That's why I need these two cases. Okay. Now let's have these two cases. And I don't need b'moadechem at the end of Parshas Pinchas, because what's common to these two cases is that they are both Korbanos Tzibbur. And from a Korban Tzibbur, I can set up a binyan av and say, just like in these two cases, the Torah says they override Tumah and Shabbos, so too in all Korbanos Tzibbur, they do the same. The only problem is that when it comes to a Bameh Matzinu, we have something called a Tzad HaChamur, which means that if the two cases A and B, which we want to use as paradigmic of all other cases, but those two cases have a Tzad Chamur, even though again, the Chiddush of a Pircha of Tzad Chamur, in the case of a Binyan Av of Bameh Matzinu, is that you can use a Tzad Chamur even though each one of these two cases, respectively, the A and the B, have a different Tzad Chamur. But what becomes common to them is that they both have a Tzad Chamur. That Pircha does not apply to a Kal V'chomer. In a Kal V'chomer, you can't slug up a Kal V'chomer, the Pircha based on Tzad Chamur. You need that the Tzad Chamur should be common to both A and B. But that's because you have the power of a Kal V'chomer. Here we don't have a power of a Kal V'chomer, we just have a Binyan A. We only have Tamid with its chumrus and Pesach with its chumrus. Is Havamina Hani Hu. These two are unique and they override Tumah and Shabbos. Why? Yesh B'hem Tzad Chamur. So it's common to these two and passes them as a binyan avis. They both have a Tzad Chamur. Again, each one has its own personality, its own Tzad Chamur. Tamid Shetadir V'Kolit. Pesach Shu Onish Koretz. Aval Shar Korbanos Tzibbur. They don't have a Tzad Chamur. Ema Lo. We would assume, unless we know otherwise, that they don't have that special unique power to override the Shabbos or Tumah. It's therefore Kos Rachmana. We need that pasuk at the end, the closure of Parshas Pinchas, the Korbanos Musaf of all the special Moadim, and it says there, Eila Tasu Hashem b'Moadechem. And now the word Moadechem upgrades all the Korbanos Tzibbur of the Regalim and of Rosh Chodesh, and we could put in the Korbanos of the Omer and the Shtei Lechem based on the pasuk Eila Moadei Hashem in Parshas Emor. Now we have a package deal, and all these Korbanos override the Shabbos and Tumah. But now we have another question. Why don't we turn it the other way around? Why don't we use this pasuk b'Moadechem as the binyan av, or even as the kal from which we could derive a kal v'chomer, and the Torah could have dropped the words b'Moado in the parshios of Tamid and Korban Pesach. The cause of Rachmana, if the Torah had said Elam Tasu Hashem b'Moadechem. So at the end of the parsha Musafei Moadim, we have a pasuk that indicates that all the Moadim override Tumah and Shabbos, and will add to boot the Minchas HaOmer and the Korban of Shtei Lechem because of the pasuk of Elam Moadei Hashem. If I only had that, Hava Amin, I would have thought Shar Korbanos Tzibbur Aboim L'Chape. He says the following, that there is something unique about Korbanos Tzibbur in general, and their purpose is l'chaper. It doesn't sit well with us. We think, well, you're bringing a korban on a regel or on Rosh Chodesh, but the Torah always goes out of its way to say lechaper, and we need that special kapara that's embedded in the yom itself and is clinched by the korban of that yom. And that's called lechaper. Now, with regard to Omer and Shtei Lechem, we don't have that element of kapara, therefore we need that special pasuk in Emor to upgrade Shtei Lechem and the Omer. I'm talking about the korbanos that accompany them to the level of being Dochet Tumah and Shabbos. Aval Omer Shtei Lechem di Einon Boim Lechaper. Now here we have a real lumptious sugya. The Gemara says, and it's a simple premise that the Gemara, fundamental premise, the Gemara never even questions it, that there are two categories of korbanos in terms of their agenda and their purpose. There is lechaper, and then there's lahatir. So in the case of Shtei Lechem, well, let's go back. In the case of the korban Omer, that korban is coming to be matir chadash in Medina, meaning outside the Beis Hamikdash. And the Shtei Lechem 7 weeks later on Chag HaShavuos is coming to be matir chadash b'migdash, meaning from the menachos that are brought from the new grain of this year as a korban mincha. You cannot bring those new grains as menachos until they become yashan. And what makes them to yashan? When we bring the first korban of the year from the new crop, the first mincha of the year from the new crop. And that's going to be the Shtei Lechem of Chag HaShavuos. But both of these korbanos, the Omer and the Shtei Lechem, form an entity unto themselves to remove the Isur Chadash and create Yashan. That's called a korban amati. So now we say the following. As far as the korbanos of Moadim, each one of them is coming lechaper. And if a korban is coming lechaper, then you know what? We're going to say, let's say we violated a mitzvah saseh, we violated a mitzvah lo saseh or lo nitak liyaseh. There are many different categories. So the chomer, the severity and the upgraded status of these korbanos of all the moadim lechaper is that they create a kapara. We need that kapara desperately. We can't give up on that korban because then we'll be left without a kapara. But Shtei Lechem and the Omer, they don't come lechaper. They're coming lahatir, to be matir the Isur of Chadash. Is low. Perhaps I would entertain a havamina that if there's a problem of Tumah or a problem of Shabbos, we're not going to override the Tumah of the Shabbos. I mean, now we're going to have to analyze what's going to be with all the Chadash. Everything is Chadash. Ad infinitum. So when do you eat Chadash? When does it become Yashan? Or alternatively, when do you bring the Korbanos Mincha on the Mizbeach from the new crop if you don't have the Shtei Lechem? And now the Gemara is going to turn it upside down. Kamash Malon, right? So the Torah tells me Moadei Hashem, and Moadei Hashem in the parsha in Emor, by number Moshe's Moadei Hashem, that includes these two korbanos of the Omer and the Shtei Lechem on to override the Shabbos and Tumah. The Ikas Rachmana Omer Shtei Lechem L'chudei. And now we're going to say the exact opposites for it. What do we need more? It's almost like a philosophical question here. Are we more desperate for kapara, for our sins, or are we more desperate for a heter? Now, again, the heter in the case of the Omer is for our eating, what's called achilas hedja. But the heter in the case of Shtei Lechem is for the mizbeach itself. We're going to run out of 5 grains of to bring korbanah, to bring menachos. Is hava min ha'adaram. If we only had the pasuk b'moadei Hashem, I would have thought Omer Shtei Lechem dalime deboim lahatir. We can't do without them. We have to bring these korbanos, even if it means overriding the Shabbos or Tumah, because otherwise we don't have a heter for Chadash. Aval Hanoch, but you know what? Maybe kapara is a luxury item. It's always good to have kapara, but if you can't have kapara through carbon, we'll find other ways of bringing. There are many mechaper, many fish in the sea. Not the least of which is tshuva. Tshuva is mechaperes, so we'll, like today, the Rambam writes at the beginning of the tshuva, we don't have the korbanos, and we don't have Yom Kippur, we don't have the Kohen Gadol. So what do we have? We have tshuva. Aval hanach lo kamash v'lo. Now we need a special limud of b'moadechem at the end of Parshas Pinchas to teach me that the korbanos of the moadim, which are coming lechaper, will override both Tumah and Shabbos. Now, I started learning this very complicated Tosfos Shekem, which is the third Tosfos on the Amud. He wants to whittle down the amount of psukim that were necessary to derive the whole gamut of Korbanos Tzibbur. Again, we couldn't derive it neither from Tamid, nor from Pesach, nor from a combination thereof. Tamid could not teach Pesach, Pesach could not teach Tamid, and the combination thereof could not teach us other Korbanos Tzibbur, and that's the Tzad HaChom. However, he says, why couldn't the Torah teach me, for example, Tamid and one Korban Tzibbur, or all the Korbanos Tzibbur under one Pasuk b'Moadechem, or Pesach and the Korbanos Tzibbur? Or, for example, teach me Tamid and the Omer. In other words, when we come up with our rejection of expanding this halach of Dechias Tumah Shabbos, because let's say we have a Tzad Chomer, or for example, we have Kapara, or we have Matir. Once we have a combination thereof, that should be sufficient. We don't need a special pasuk to teach me all these different korbanos. So that's the subject of this Tosfos. Again, it's a very complicated Tosfos. We're going to have to leave it for now. Now, again, the Gemara had clarified the source for our Mishnah, that korbanos that have a set time, all the 5 categories, and we added both the Seirim of Regolim and the Seirim of Rosh Chodashim. You can override Tumah. So the Gemara wants to know now, how does that operate? And we're about to start a sugya, which is a classic. You may realize, I don't have to tell you, that the distinction between what we call dechuya and hutra is a very fundamental distinction that has an impact on many sugyas in Shas. And this is really the sugya. I mean, I shouldn't say this is, because it's this and the Gemara in Yoma, both together are dealing and addressing the same problem about hutra or dechuya in the case of Tumah. So let's just give a very superficial, surface level distinction or explanation of the difference between hutra and dechuya as far as Tumah is concerned. When we have a situation of, again, I'm going to use the word dechuya, but I'm deliberately avoiding the machlok between dechuya and hutra, but dechuya in Tumah, one can understand that in 2 ways. One way is to say, look, you know what? We can't find a Kohen Tar. We can't find a Bailim Tahorim. We've just got so many, so many who are in the state of Tumah. So you know what? The Torah says, for the sake of the Karban, for Kapara, or it's such a Karban Chamur, it's an Isakares, or for example, it's Talmud in Kolil, or it's Lamatir, we're going to look aside and we're going to allow bringing the Karban B'tum. We really don't want to bring the Karban B'tum. But these are the situations and the circumstances on the ground, as we'd say, that we didn't write the script, but that's what it is. And that's why we have to, for the sake of the korban, we'll have to override Tumah. The other way is to say hutra. Hutra means that the Torah was the source for prohibiting Korbanos Tzibbur. I mean, after all, you and I would have said, okay, so he's Tameh, so what? Therefore, he can't bring the korban. The Torah says that in a case of Tumah, I was the one who told you not to bring the korban, but if there's a tzibur element in the equation, right, that the entire tzibur, or I shouldn't say the entire tzibur, but most of the tzibur are tmeim, I'm going to be matir. I meaning the Torah. That's like who Omar, v'hu Omar, Heim Omru v'Heim Omru, right? You're familiar with that phrase, right? It means that who most of lo mafarikla. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu is saying, forget about Tumah. Tumah is not an issue at all. Sounds very abstract, but it's not abstract. It is Pashat L'maisa, very practical. Because if you hold Tumah D'chuya B'tzibur, then you're really overriding the law of Tumah. This is not the way a korban should be brought, but you have no choice. If you do have a choice, then don't leave any leaf unturned, any stone unturned. You're going to have to go to the ends of the world in order to avoid and circumvent the problem of a korban b'tumah. That's called tumah d'chuya b'tzibur. So imagine that the avodas hakohanim are divided up into mishmaros. There are 24 mishmaros, and each mishmaros gets 2 weeks out of the year. They divide the year into 6 months, etc., etc. And then they divide up each mishmaros into 7 batei av, and each base av gets 1 day. So as it turns out, the kohanim on this particular day of a base av are tmeim. That's not the end of the world. Now you're going to recruit the kohanim of tomorrow's base av who are tahorim, and if you can't find tahorim in the entire mishmeres, then you're going to recruit a different mishmeres that is not meant to serve in the base of for another 2 weeks down the line. Let them come in and put in every effort that you possibly can in order to circumvent the problem of having to bring the korban b'tumah. That's called tumah d'chuya b'tzibur. And of course, you can decide and analyze under what circumstances or how far do you have to go, to stretch it. There's a Kohen somewhere at the end of the Antarctic Ocean, in Antarctica, and how far do we go in order to try to bring this korban b'tara instead of b'tumah? If you hold hutra, that's a whole different story. Hutra means there's no tumah over here. Why? Because we have a rov tmeim, and the Torah says in the case of rov tmeim, bring the korban. Don't even blink about it. Don't look around to try to find a substance. So Savrua, the Gemara thought initially, Bilakuli Alma, everybody holds that Tumah D'chuya B'tzibur. So the definition of Korbanos Tzibbur that are brought B'tumah is called D'chuya. And D'chuya means that if need be, and we have no choice, the korban is going to go down the tubes if we don't bring it B'tumah, then that's what we're going to do. And D'chuya means that for the sake of X, you violate Y, but you violate it. Like, for example, the classic case of D'chuya, again, we're not learning this sugi, but I'll just mention it, is Esei Docha Lotase. It doesn't mean there's no Lotase. I mean, there is a parsha called Gedilim Tasalecha in the case where you make the tzitzis out of tzemer on a beged shel pishton. That's already a different Allah. That's mitzvah sobekach. That's the way the Torah describes the mitzvah. But that's not what we're talking. We're talking about a coincidental clash between a mitzvah saseh and a mitzvah lo saseh. So in such a case, we say d'chia. If you have no choice, then violate the lo taseh for the sake of the mitzvah saseh. And that's called d'chia. The Gemara thinks that the same mechanics applies in the case of a korban tzibbur. If the korban tzibbur is faced with a problem, an issue of tumah, So if we have no choice, we'll apply the principle of Bechia. And therefore, the Hakravas HaKarban, for the sake of that great mitzvah, the Kapara, etc., is Docha the Isser of Tumah. Is if that be the case, the Gemara says, then Boy Tzitz Leratus. We are bringing the carbon B'tumah. The Torah does not allow a carbon to be brought B'tumah. So you need a kapara. You need a matir. You need a carbon that's tamid and kolil, and it's an isukares and so forth and so on. Okay, you need it, but it's B'tumah. How is the carbon effective? It's B'tumah. And you need what's called ritzui tzitz. Now, what ritzui tzitz means is that the Kohen is wearing his tzitz on his forehead at the moment that they brought the carbon. If you don't have the Kohen wearing the tzitz, let's say he took a break, he went to the washroom. Here they call it the sherutim. And he took off the tzitz. He went to sleep at night, he took off his tzitz. Then tzitz is not maratzah, because you need the mitzcho shel Kohen Gadol in order to set up the tzitz with its power to be maratzal atuma. Maratzal atuma means to generate the ritzui and the validity of the carbon to be machaper, etc., through the tzitz. The tzitz becomes the conduit, the means to generate a kapara. So yes, you can bring the Korbanos Tzibbur b'tumah, but that's based on what we call in modern Hebrew the shituf pa'ula, the partnership of the Kohen Gadol who's wearing the tzitz. It's almost as if we're saying that the carbon per se is possible, and we need something to be machshir the carbon. And the dechia will only allow you to bring the carbon, but it doesn't effectuate a hechsher hakarbon. The only agent that could effectuate the hechsher hakarbon is the tzitz. Now, why did the Gemara think that everybody would agree to this? This is like, this is unanimous. He says, the leka tana de shamet the omar tuma hucha b'tzibur ela Rabbi Yehuda. We're going to learn now a brisa that records a machlokas shina chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda. The assumption is that, with the exception of Rabbi Yehuda, all the chachamim ganged up on Rabbi Yehuda, and they agreed unanimously that Tumah is the Chuya B'tzibur. The Sanya sits Bein Sheyeshna al Mitzcho. This is all Rabbi Shimon. We're going to see Rabbi Yehuda in a minute. Bein She'eno al Mitzcho Meratz. So the power of the tzitz is inherent in the tzitz. It doesn't require levicha that the Kohen Gadol is wearing the tzitz. Again, if the tzitz is broken, then everybody agrees that it cannot effectuate a ritzui on a carbon b'tumah. But we're talking about the tzitz is whole. It's in perfect shape. It's just not on the metzach of the Kohen Gadol. It's divrei Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, odeu al mitzcho meratza, ein odeu al mitzcho ein meratza. The ritzui tzitz is only effective through the Kohen Gadol, because the Kohen Gadol is wearing the tzitz. That levicha, which sets up the relationship between the tzitz and the Kohen Gadol, that's what empowers the tzitz to be meratza. So he's got to be wearing it. Amalo Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon turns to Rabbi Yehuda and he says the following: Kohen Gadol b'yom Kippur nochia. The Kohen Gadol goes lifnai v'lifnim with the Kodesh Kadashim. He's wearing arba begadim. He's not wearing the tzitz. So how could it be that the Kohen Gadol, by going lifnai v'lifnim, is going to generate a ritzui tzitz when he's not wearing the tzitz on behalf of all the karbanos shenitmu? So if there was a carbon that was nitma, what generates the ritzui of that carbon on the holiest day of Yom Kippurim? You're going to tell me, Rabbi Yehuda, because it sits al mitzcho? What do you mean sits al mitzcho? The moment of ritzui is that moment when the Kohen Gadol enters into the Holy of Holies. And in fact, he's not wearing the tzitz at that moment. she'eno al mitzcho umeratze, and it generates ritzui on the korbanos that became tomei. Amalo, so Rabbi Yehuda responds, meratze. I'm sorry. Amalo hanach liyom kippurim shetuma hutra b'tzibur. The only way I can understand how the Kohen Gadol can go in lifnai v'lifnim on Yom Kippurim without it sins, and yet there'll be ritzui on the Korbanos shenitmu, is only if I assume tuma hutra b'tzibur, so that according to Rabbi Yehuda, we need the tzitz to be worn on the forehead of the Kohen Gadol in order to generate the ritzui, but not with regard to the entry of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippurim lifnai v'lifnim. That's a special din of Tuma Hutra B'tzibur that applies to Yom Kippurim. But as far as other korbanos, you need ritzui tzitz, and that depends upon whether the Kohen Gadol is wearing the tzitz al mitzcho. So this is where we're going to stop for today. Mitzvah Hashem. Tomorrow we're going to get into this whole sugya, this whole enterprise called Tuma Hutra B'tzibur, and how it impacts on the ritzui tzitz, and especially with regard to Rabbi Yehuda Shita of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. So let me just take this opportunity to wish everyone a great day, and thank you so much.